Welcome to The Right Approach. This is actually our inaugural podcast episode. We are your hosts. I am J.W. Judge.
And I'm Barbara Hinske. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic every single week. So let's get started.
And I just discovered that since J.W. Judge is my pen name, I currently have my given name on here, which is no secret, but I'm going to change it for the sake of clarity. So here we are. Now we're all synchronous here.
Good.
All right. Um, so let's start with we should probably introduce ourselves because I'm JW Judge. I have had a podcast called Lawyerpreneur, which I ran under my given name, Jeremy Richter, um, and have after 2 years hung that up. I am a lawyer doing commercial litigation in Birmingham, Alabama. After writing 3 books about law practice, I decided to try my hand at writing fiction. But unlike most lawyers, I didn't jump straight into legal thrillers or writing about lawyers. I went to dark fantasy and have now written 3 novels in a trilogy called the Zaberi Chronicles and have working on my 4th, and we can get into that. So that's just a brief introduction to who I am. Barbara, why don't you introduce yourself?
So my pen name is Barbara Hinske, which is my maiden name. Um, I'm a former lawyer. I was a transactional lawyer, not a litigator. And when I began writing, I didn't start writing legal thrillers either. I write women's fiction with with a little hint of mystery, thriller, and suspense, which kind of is inspired by my law practice because I had a lot to do with financial fraud and all that. So those themes tend to find their way into all my books. I write general fiction, literary fiction, and sweet Christmas stories. And I've had one of my novels, The Christmas Club, was made into a Hallmark Channel Christmas movie in 2019 of the same name. And I've got another book headed to the screen as well. So that's my pedigree.
All right, so let's do. I think as we get going on this podcast, one of the first things that we'll do each episode is personal updates about either the writing side or the publishing side of our businesses, since we have both chosen to be independent authors and go about our work that way. So, why don't you start with what's going on with what you can tell us about either the writing or publishing side of what you've got going on right now?
Okay. So this past week has been busy. I've sent the my third book in my Guiding Emily series. Title is Over Every Hurdle, and that's gone to proofreading. So that's always a really moment. And No Rest for the Weary. I had enough ideas left over in my brain from book 3 that I decided to sit down and write book 4 now. Guiding Emily is the book that's going to the screen, and they've been asking about maybe it'll be a series. And boy, I'd love it to be a series. And they say, so what's happened in the later books? Well, book 2 was written, but 3 and 4 weren't. So nothing was happening. And I decided I better sit down and write them. So that's what I'm doing. And what are you doing on your end?
Well, so I mentioned that I have started my 4th novel, which is also it is not the novel that I intended to write next after I had finished my first trilogy in my series. And so I finished that 3rd book back in I think May, and then finished a nonfiction book about writing after that that's going to come out in November. It's called Write Your Novel One Day at a Time. And then I intended to write, or I guess finish, a novel that I started back in 2019, but I just wasn't getting anywhere as I was thinking through it. And this book just came out of nowhere, and so I started writing it. I wrote very, very consistently throughout most of July, and then in the last week, work has gotten just out of control. And so in the last week, I've only written 2 of the last 6 or 7 days, and even that was very little. So and then looking ahead, my calendar is gonna be pretty crazy over the next 4 months. So I had planned to finish that book by the end of the year. I am still hopeful about that, but we'll see. I recognize that with work being what it is, that just might not happen. So we'll
It,
see.
it's always hard to accept those natural barriers, but sometimes we have to.
Yeah, and when the law practice is paying the bills and the writing isn't, then, the writing has to take a hiatus.
Yeah,
Alright,
yeah.
so our topic today is where do stories come from? Where do your story ideas come from? And I know this is going to be different for everybody, but I think it's a topic that's of interest both to writers and to readers of,
Mm.
where do you writers get all these wild ideas? And for me in my books, they really truly have been wild ideas. So let's start with you. And you'd mentioned that there's a relationship between the practice you had and the fraud and financial transactions and the stories you have written. So what sparks inspiration for you? Where do the ideas come from?
My ideas come from a very diverse group of sources. And I feel like I never run out of ideas. People ask that. I have more ideas up here than I have time to write. My Rosemont series came when I was recovering from a car accident. I had a broken neck. I was in a neck brace, no pain and no lower body injuries, but I had severe trauma to my eyes. I had double vision. I couldn't use a computer, read, watch TV, none of that. So I was bored out of my mind. I would walk 3 or 4 hours every day. And I kept thinking, I always wanted to write when I retired someday. So I just thought, well, you know, what would be interesting to me? And I came up with my Rosemont series, the characters, a lot of the plot lines. I thought, gee, it'd be fun to write a 5 book series. Well, now I'm at 8. But so I mapped out in my mind a 5 book series. That's where Rosemont came from. And so Rosemont has fraud, embezzlement, arson, financial crimes. Later on, it had some murders, the whole bit. But that fraud and embezzlement definitely came from my law practice days. My Christmas story that was made into a Hallmark movie was based very loosely on a homily that I heard in church 35 years ago. So the initial incident in the book came from the homily, and then I added a whole bunch to it, fictionalized it. The basic idea of it was to do kind things for other people, but do them in nice ways. Don't always expect the attaboy, the pat on the back. We all like that. I want people to say, "Oh, aren't you wonderful?" Don't we all? But that isn't always a good thing to do. That's what the Christmas Club is about: selfless kindness.
Can I
And
jump in and ask you a question?
yeah, yeah.
All right, the Rosemont series, did you go from never having written fiction to planning a 5 book series, or was there lead up to that?
No, it was because I had nothing else to do. I mean, I
That's
was
amazing.
walking, and I didn't have the full 5 books. I wrote the first book, got a developmental, and it took me over a year, got a
Mm.
developmental edit on it, had to write in a whole nother plot arc, and then published it from there. And I used my maiden name because I thought I'm still practicing law. I don't want to humiliate myself if I'm a terrible writer. And it turned out I was an okay writer, and some people other than my friends and family bought it and wanted the sequel. So that started the series.
So when you started writing that first Rosemont book,
Yeah.
well, let me start with an anecdote. When I first started my first novel, I had written 2 nonfiction books at that point about law practice, and I mean, hundreds of thousands of words on my law blog and in the writing practice. So I knew nonfiction, but I
Mhm.
sat down and I had and still have this idea for a book that I'm going to write it at some point. But when I started the writing of it, I realized I don't know how to do this.
Mm,
And I kind of picked my way through it, and I wrote about 15,000 words in that novel
mhm,
before I set it aside and said, "This book is too close to my heart because it deals with this family tragedy that we had with people that I
mhm,
never knew, but I wanted to do it well, and I didn't know enough about storytelling
mhm,
to be able to do it." So I set it aside, and I haven't picked it back up yet, and started writing a second novel that I got another 15 or 20,000 words into, and probably in December or January of, let's see, December 2019, January 2020, it kind of faltered, and then we got into the pandemic, and I just couldn't do it. But, so I've had 2 novels that I really realized I don't know what I'm doing here. This is so different. And it was incredibly enjoyable, but so much more difficult than the other things. So, how did you find writing that first book?
That is so interesting just to think about writing. And maybe this will be an encouragement to other writers out there because I was never a writer. My undergraduate before law school was I was an engineer. And I went to law school and started at a big firm. And there were two of us that they looked at, and I was a transactional lawyer, and they said, "Oh my God, these two people can't form a complete sentence practically." So they hired the dean of the local law school to mentor us. And unfortunately, the other lawyer was a little too proud and he didn't do it. But I thought, oh my
Mm.
God, this is great. So 2 years later, I'm still in this mentorship program, one on one with this marvelous lawyer. It wasn't creative writing until, the senior partner said, oh my God, how much money are we spending on this? They cut this thing off. But it taught me some writing. So then when I started creative writing, I guess I'm pretty good at letting myself do things that I really don't know how to do. I just kind of banged it out as a reader. But then I worked with a developmental editor who I clicked with. So now she's my writing coach and I write everything with her. We do it weekly. I do write. My goal is to write 10,000 words a week, 10 to 12, send it to her, we critique, and then we keep going. Now I'm at the point where I can, when I'm done with a rough draft, through this process, I send it through Pro Writing Aid for all the little bitty stuff. I do one read aloud edit, and then it goes to copy editing for me.
Oh,
So it has
wow.
been, I guess I have learned to write through working with this very talented developmental editor who is my writing coach. It's made all the difference in the world.
That's interesting, and my experience is not dissimilar on that front. When I started writing what became my first finished novel, Vulcan Rising, and we'll get back to where the idea for it came from, but
I want to
when
hear.
I got into a few chapters into it, I had an acquaintance who I knew through an online community that we're a part of, and she's a lawyer in North Carolina and used to be a teacher, like I used to be a high school teacher, and she's a voracious reader and reads 100
Mhm.
books a year. And so I reached out to her when I started writing this and said, "Look, can I send this to you and you can tell me the good, bad, and ugly? Like, I'm ready." And I knew that she would, and that she wouldn't hold back. And if it was terrible, then she would tell me. And, she came back with a few suggestions. And my main character it's about a husband and a wife and a young family, and it's a fantasy book. And so things get real weird real fast. But I thought it was going to be the husband's story, where he learns about this
Mhm.
magical world that he didn't know anything about. But she pointed out to me early on that the wife is more interesting, and
Interesting.
it totally changed the book for the better. Like, it's
Mhm.
such a better book because I realized, oh, she is super interesting. And so then it became a book about both of them, and it split the points of view, and it became much more her story. It's both of their stories, but it's so much more about her than what I envisioned, and became such a different novel and then series from what I didn't think it was going to be a series. I thought it was going to be a standalone, but as I got to writing the last quarter of the book, I realized how it had to
Mhm.
end, and how that was going to be another two books come out of it. And I so then I would just send her chunks at a time, and
Yeah.
we would go through it just like you described. And I know some people can't work that way, and they want to write the whole thing without feedback and then take another shot at
Mhm.
it, but it's been really transformative for me to have that feedback if I can send it in chunks. And it wasn't, I'd stopped writing two novels. For years, I've been listening to podcasts about craft and
Mhm.
reading books about writing craft. And as I was writing that book, I didn't have a plan. I guess I'll just jump in now with how the story started. In January of 2020, I my son called me up to his room in the middle of the night and told me that he thought there was something on his bed. And we had had a roof leak months earlier. And I was like, oh no, we have another roof leak, because it was in his room over his bed. And then I realized it's not raining. So it's not a roof leak. And, I feel around on his bed and there's nothing there. And he asked me to lay down beside him. And so I do. And he immediately goes back to sleep because, he's 5 and they have that ability, and I don't. And I just go into this. My brain starts going 1,000 miles an hour about, what if there were some imaginary creature in his room that only he could see, but I, as an adult, couldn't see. And, you know, I don't know. I just started thinking about that, and I wrote it down in the morning, like, okay, this is this weird thing that
Mhm.
I thought about. A couple months later, oh, I guess it was August, August of 2020, um, he came down in the morning and just had this really strange demeanor. And, kids, you never know. So I asked him what was wrong, and he said nothing. And then he said he saw a shadow on the stairs and it scared him, or, something like that. So I just kind of made a mental note about that. Then a couple weeks later, I had this really super strange dream that I woke up in the middle of the night in the dream and saw some guys walking into the woods behind our house. And
Mhm.
so I get a handgun and go outside and wait to see what's going on, because, that's not normal. A few minutes later, these three guys emerge from the woods, and one of them is carrying something. And they come to the driveway where I'm standing, and there's an altercation. And I end up shooting one of the guys and force the other guy to set down what he's carrying. And it turns out he has a Pegasus Colt in his arms that he's carrying. And then they leave, and I've got to figure out what to do with this Pegasus and, like, return it to its mother. And woke up from that and wrote that all down. And after that, and I may have the order in which these things happened, but those 3 episodes, once the third one happened, I realized, okay, I can tie all this together, because this is all kind of strangely dark. And so the dream about the Pegasus became the second and third chapter of Vulcan Rising, and the whole thing just took off out of that. And I wrote that in, and it's a 70,000 word novel that I wrote in 3.5 months. It all just kind of came flooding
Wow.
out.
Wow.
And so that was the first one. And the other one's built on that. But you have mentioned, um, or maybe you didn't get to it, your Guiding Emily series, but tell us
Yeah.
about where the idea for that came from.
So, yeah, my Guiding Emily series is probably the closest I've had to the experience you just described, where ideas just come to you. I was seated at a black tie dinner for a local library next to the development director of the Foundation for Blind Children in Phoenix, Arizona. The foundation is about a mile from my house, and we're chatting away. And he said, "You've never been? You've lived next to it for 30 some years. Come and take a tour the next week." And so my husband and I did. And the foundation serves not just children, but adults as well. And I was so moved. My husband and I were fighting back tears almost within minutes from when we walked in the door to see what they were doing. And we got to the Braille library. The foundation produces a lot of Braille that's used around the world, actually. And there was a big check on the wall from Major League Baseball for $1 million. And I thought, I want to check on that wall for me for $2 million. But I'm not wealthy, so that I need to figure out how. And I thought, you know what? I can write a book. A book can raise money, and I donate half the proceeds of Guiding Emily to the foundation. And I turned to the development director and I said, "What do you need? What can I do to help?" And he said, "Well, nonprofit, we need money, of course, but we also need the sighted community to understand how isolated blind people feel when they go out in the community." And I thought, okay, I can do that in a book as well. I can shine a light on that. So as we're talking, and the president of the foundation comes up and we're talking with him, I felt like this electric charge through my body, literally. And I don't believe in that stuff very much, but I did. And I came up with this idea of Guiding Emily, which is the story of a young woman, Emily Main, who loses her eyesight on her honeymoon, and parallel story of Garth, her eventual guide dog, who's a puppy, and he's going through the puppy raising, puppy training process. And at the end of the book, they come together. So the foundation was hugely helpful in my research, and I was able to network my way into Guide Dogs for the Blind in San Rafael, California, and spent 3 days graciously with them behind the scenes, seeing their operation. And it's just the first book did so well that I kept wanting to keep the series going. So now I've got a third one coming out early November, the fourth one I'm writing. And I have to say, I get comments weekly from newly blind adults who say the book has given them hope. If I don't do anything else good in my life, I've done this, and I'm very proud of the fact that Guiding Emily has replaced Huckleberry Finn, of all things, as the training book for adult Braille readers. And they did, because it is contemporary. It is honest in its depiction of your descent into despair and depression from losing your eyesight as an adult, and then hopeful as you pull your way out. So Guiding Emily was a little bit of an anomaly because I sat down with the Garth character in my mind. I'm a dog owner. I hope we don't hear them barking on this, but occasionally
Oh, if we
they
don't hear yours, we will at some point hear my golden
good.
retriever. So it's going to
Oh,
happen.
I love those Goldens. Yeah. So, um, yeah, it's just all. I came out of there with two characters fully formed. I had a lot of research to do, which I did. And within, I want to say 9 months, I had that ready to publish.
Wow.
So it all just poured. That's unusual.
Yeah. And so, yeah, where I want to go next is talking about what we do with story ideas once you have them, because I think that process, like where the idea itself comes from, is going to look different for everybody. So I know that a lot of times I don't know what form an idea is going to take. And sometimes it's dreams. And I've written, short stories that I've had dreams. And sometimes, I mean, I've always had really vivid dreams that I can sometimes remember just amazingly well. And so
I'm so jealous.
and so, I'll write those down, and I have a moleskin notebook that I use to write things like that down. Sometimes it's just a title idea, and I have, maybe a dozen ideas for titles of books that I haven't written, and I don't know what they'll be, but I have this title that I think is a great title, and now I've got to figure out something to write to get to it. But
I
that
get
said,
jealous. Yeah.
I usually find titles to be one of the hardest parts of writing a
Mhm.
book.
Yeah, it's
Um,
really good.
and then once I have that initial idea and I record it so I won't forget it, whether it's a snippet or a fully formed idea, once I start preparing to write, I have a spreadsheet that because I'm a total nerd and I love
Ah,
spreadsheets. And
wow.
so I developed a spreadsheet out of Sean Coyne's Story Grid book, where he gives a really amazing spreadsheet. And so I kind of built a framework for my stories of, you have the inciting incident and the first half of act two and the second half of act two, and then, the ending payoff is the third act, and what broadly, needs to happen within those different sections of the book. And so I'll start framing out my story that way. And I haven't for any of my books done the whole thing ahead of writing. Um, and really, I only started it with the second, which came with its own problems of I didn't have a protagonist when I started writing it. And we can talk about or I didn't have an antagonist. I had protagonists.
Mhm.
I knew who the main characters were, but I didn't have a bad guy. And I think we'll really talk about that book a lot when we get into our episode about research for writing
Mhm.
fiction, because that has a really cool story about it. But I'll start filling out that spreadsheet, which is my framework and structure for where the novel is going to go and the certain things that need to happen within it and the timing of when those go to happen. So, um, that's more of once I get started on it. But usually, I have a spreadsheet for my ideas too, because that just helped me keep everything organized. So once you have an idea, what's next for you?
Oh my gosh, I'm feeling like such a slacker hearing all this. I write down ideas and I stick them in different places that I think I'll remember and looking for that. And I'm an organized person. If you saw my office, you wouldn't say it's a mess. It's not. But when I start looking for an idea, I generally end up cleaning my office and going through, and it's just a nightmare. So I need to do the spreadsheet thing or at least use notes or something. Um, I used to, well, I'm not a pantser. You're not either. I mean, you're like plotter on steroids is what you. I don't spreadsheet it, but I used to do like a chapter kind of outline that my writing coach had me do, and I've kind of gotten away from that. But I'll start a book with an idea of what the plot arcs are going to be, what we're going to have my especially if you're doing a series, you've got your characters, so you know what development they're going to make during the series. And then I'm using the plotter software, PLOTTR, to kind of keep track and have an outline of what I do, and then keep a character Bible, which since I write in series and I tend to write lots of characters, you'd think I would remember it since I've written the books, and you would be wrong. I don't remember.
No.
So Plotter has been a very helpful tool so far, but generally now that I'm writing weekly with Lyndon, her name is Lyndon Gross, is my editor, and she's wonderful. We'll talk about where things need to go. I am better than I was in the beginning, realizing, okay, main character has been off the page for a couple of scenes or a couple of chapters, time to bring her back. The Guiding Emily series, um, it can be very heavy, particularly the first book. Someone who loses their eyesight and they go into an almost paralyzing depression. That would have been a very heavy, sad book to read if it wasn't for the Garth chapters told first. Only I write in third person, but Garth is first person, and he writes from the sweet doggy point of view. And he's like all dogs. I mean, he's like God in a character. So those chapters had to be interspersed carefully to just lighten the book. But I don't have spreadsheets, and I'm thinking I should learn this from you.
I don't know. It seems like what's working for you is working pretty well. we I don't we're running kind of up on the time restraints that we kind of set for ourselves about what we want the podcast to be. We have another part of this topic about deciding what to write next, which could probably take up its own 20 or 30-minute slot. And
Yeah.
so let's save that for another episode. Um, we have coming up in our so this is episode one. We've got some great guests already lined up that we will tell you about it after we record them so that we don't jinx anything to make sure all that goes through.
Mhm.
But we're really excited about it. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to continuing this for the indefinite future.
Yep. S- So happy to be here and looking forward to what comes next.